Yep. And as we actually focused during a previous speech on the trend that all the resource, the human, the technological, the everything will be focused on the 600 cities probably. And we also think that probably that the high-tech industry, the technology and everything else will be focused on the hubs and the clusters and everything else. Probably there isn't a possibility just to build the startups and the deep tech startups outside the Silicon Valley. Benjamin, Joffe.
Thank you.
Labrit.
Labrit, Riga. Labrit, right. I'm trying to get it right. So I'm from France. I lived in 9 different countries now. And I think as French, we have this great gift that we can learn a lot of languages and speak everything in French. So, but I'm not going to tell you about my travels. Rather, I'm going to tell you about the opportunities there is in technology today, particularly in deep tech and outside Silicon Valley. So this is my first time in Riga. My grandfather, actually one of my grandfathers, came from Lithuania, which is not that far from Riga. And when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking, okay, what do I actually know about Latvia? Turns out there was very little. I tried to compensate for my ignorance to tune the talk today, and looked online, okay, maybe I know some things about Latvian people that I don't even know I know. So I looked for celebrities, and so who's the most famous Latvian person, according to you? And who's that? We have like different opinions here, but that's good. So there's more than one. Wonderful. I found one guy. I found this guy. I think he's a little bit famous. I thought, okay, that's a good start, but that's not going to help my talk so much. And you know, when you start to look on the internet, you look for information, and very quickly you end up on YouTube and you watch videos, right? So I started to watch videos, and I came onto these channels about magic, and then I came onto this channel about this guy doing analysis of like fake videos, and I spent like many hours actually watching his videos, wonderful videos, because you know in this era of fake news, it's so interesting to see how you can create those deep fakes. So it's not deep tech, but it's deep fakes. And I also came across Latvian science. I found some articles talking about some discoveries made by Latvian scientists. I thought that was quite interesting. A lot of things in material science, things in medicine. But this is the guy who actually makes those videos about analysis of fake videos. Captain Dissolution. I thought, oh, that's a really great name because, yeah, it's about helping people open eyes about the reality of things. Turns out Captain Dissolution is born in Riga. He has 1.5 million followers, so I guess you're all following him, are you, right? No. So it's really interesting what he does, because he's not only very good at what he's doing, but I think he's actually doing a very useful public service. So I thought about that, and I tried to use some of that in my talk, because overall there's, I think, some kind of a mystique about Silicon Valley, about how amazing it is compared to the rest of the world. But really, why is it so amazing? What's special about it? And is it really the best place to be for everything? And as I will try to demonstrate, it's actually not always the best place to be. And it's all about resources and looking at things for what they actually are, a little bit like Captain Dissolution is doing with videos. So telling you a bit more about what we do. So we're an investment fund, American investment fund, very global, called SOSV. There's a hardware deep tech branch within this fund called HAX, in which I'm a partner of. SOSV has about $500 million under management. We've invested in over 800 startups. We invest in about 150 startups every year, about 1/3 in biology, 1/3 in deep tech hardware, and 1/3 in other things, including software, blockchain, and other things. We're very active in IoT, very active in health tech. We're the 3rd most active in the world last year for early stage investments. Interestingly, our brand is not as well known as others on these charts, mostly because we run very separate operations for our different categories. And until recently, the fund itself didn't think it was necessary to promote its own brand. Our model is to invest at a very early stage, at pre-seed stage. There's even a pre-seed, which I think is what actually you are doing here, getting the teams together, discuss ideas, and that's too early for us. But as soon as there's a prototype, we can talk. And then we keep investing at the seed and Series A. So that's our model. We're very global. I used to be based in the Shenzhen office for about 4 years. I've lived in Asia for about 18 years, in Japan, Korea, China, Singapore. These days I'm in Paris. I'm traveling a lot because we invest all around the world. We like to call ourselves hands-on capital because not only we have investment capital, but also we have set up large labs to help the teams with hands-on expertise. So on the left of the picture, you can see the San Francisco lab on Jesse Street, if some of you went there in downtown San Francisco. And that's like a little bit like in the series Breaking Bad. Like you go underground and you see a lot of scientists with lab coats like making stuff, and it looks a little bit strange, especially when you see the people in the street. San Francisco has some problems. In Shenzhen, it's all about electronics. Shenzhen has the best supply chain for electronics in the entire world. It's very, very fast. It's very efficient. It's pretty cost-effective. And that helps startups to do a lot more in less time with less cash, so they can be really efficient there. Some of the startups in our portfolio, some of you might know, some maybe not. One of the most successful ones these days for us is a company called MakeBlock. They make robots for education. They raised about 70, $80 million in total. The valuation is close to 400 million. They sell all around the world their products. What's very interesting is that you couldn't tell from the picture, and you couldn't tell from the packaging or from their brand, but it's a Chinese company. And it's one of those companies from China that are making globally amazing products. Another one called Memphis Meats is making meat in a lab, which is the most humane way of actually making meat cells. They're not yet at the stage where you can buy a burger for $5 or less, but that's kind of the target. We have a few others. I won't go into details. Some of more recent startups in the deep tech categories we work on, we have things in digital therapies. That means devices that heal you. On the left, you see a brain stimulation device, a company from Sweden called Flow Neuroscience, that helps treat depression with a device. So this company is not competing with Fitbit, not competing with the Apple Watch. They're competing with antidepressants. They're competing with pharmaceutical companies. We have diagnostic tools, digital tools for labs, industrial automation, consumer tech. You can see here Stevie Wonder wearing one very interesting headset I'm going to tell you a bit more about. And for those of you who like AI computer vision, there's already a lot in robotics, but this is basically computer vision applied to pest management in like airports and a lot of other junkyards, a lot of other places where you have problems with all sorts of pets. So let's talk about Silicon Valley. Maybe a quick survey. Who has watched the show HBO Silicon Valley? So I watched it. It's part of my work, right? Feels a bit too close to home sometimes, but anyway, okay. So a few of you have watched it. It's pretty entertaining. It's kind of a compact way of kind of looking at the crazy life of startups. Not bad. But it doesn't really delve into why Silicon Valley is the way it is and what are really its key elements. So first thing to understand that Silicon Valley didn't come overnight. It's a result of about 7 large technological cycles that every time created a wave of entrepreneurs, a wave of capital that then got returned, and entrepreneurs and people that got trained. So after 7 cycles, now you have a very mature ecosystem of capitalists, of investors, of entrepreneurs, of engineers, of lawyers, of bankers, all sorts of people who can support that ecosystem. And it also has a set of resources. So, of course, when we think about Silicon Valley, we also think about funding. US is still a very large amount, large share of the VC funding in the world. China has been a very fast-growing share. This is the VC funding last year, about $300 billion around the world, about bit more than a third, probably 40% in USA. China has been up and down, but pretty sizable. Rest of the world. If you calculate based on the population, this is what Latvia should get every year in terms of venture capital. Maybe it sounds like a lot, maybe it doesn't sound like a lot. That sounds like a Series B of a Silicon Valley company. So ideally, what can you do to do more than that and to punch above the weight of the population, essentially? So let's break down what an ecosystem is. And after living in different ecosystems like Japan, like China, working in Silicon Valley, I've talked to a lot of journalists, and they often ask, and the government people, they often ask, how can we turn our city or country into the next Silicon Valley? How can we make this the next Silicon Valley of that? And I was like, okay, how do we even talk about it if we don't describe what Silicon Valley is? And I wrote a long list of criteria where I felt, that could describe Silicon Valley. Okay, there's a lot of angel investors. Okay, there's a lot of engineers. There's technical universities. There's government grants. So I wrote a long list, and then I started to see some categories emerge. And those are the 5 categories that kind of emerged from that. There's the market, there's the capital access, there's the talent, infrastructure, and regulations. But let's break it down further. If you look at market, there's local market. Some countries, very lucky for them, they have very large local market, US, China. Some others, sometimes, maybe Russia, Indonesia these days have some pretty strong local companies. And to some scale, you can reach pretty large companies in a number of markets. There's some that are regional, and there's some that are global. Generally, global means, okay, it's your country, or you just go straight to US. That's generally what global means. Capital access. In some countries, you have maybe seed investment from support from the government, and then some support from venture capitalists, but not many angels, and not much growth capital, not much opportunities for exits like IPOs or M&As. So those are actually quite important. I will tell you more about that. Talent is not only technology. Like, for instance, I've been going to Japan year after year, going back to Japan, to try to find startups to invest in. And every time I felt a bit disappointed because I always hear about the same few startups in our particular domain. I'm like, how come there's not more startups? They have so many good engineers, they have so many good designers. As it turns out, I think they're probably lacking in terms of entrepreneurs and in terms of salespeople or marketers. They're not that good at that. Probably the way of selling for a Japanese company is say, okay, here is our product, and they just wait. And you look at it, and because you're smart and they respect you, you will see their product is amazing and the best in the world, so you will buy it. So they don't need to say anything. It's not exactly the way it works. So it doesn't really work that well for them. And I think outside of a very few countries where people are more trained toward marketing and sales, and I would put, of course, the United States, probably Israel, and a rare few others, most others are really not that good, actually, at sales and marketing. Infrastructures also play a role. Of course, internet and mobile infrastructures, so you can deploy solutions, but also payment, logistics, and even utilities. Like when you have power cuts all the time, how do you manage that? I remember visiting India about 5 years ago and going to one of the big startup media companies, and they showed me they had like 3 different routers with 3G, so because the internet is cut all the time and power is cut, and we try to keep operations on, so we have like crazy redundancy of everything. Regulations also matter. How easy it is to incorporate, how easy it is to go bankrupt. In some countries, if you're an entrepreneur, you go bankrupt, you're personally liable. You can go to jail, or you can be in debt for the rest of your life. There's even jokes, I remember, in Korea from a few years ago, saying, why is there no Steve Jobs in Korea? Because Steve Jobs kind of bankrupted one of company, and then he would have had to work for Samsung for 20 years to pay his debt. Employment laws, immigration, taxes, taxation for investors, taxation for entrepreneurs, all those matter to entrepreneurship. So those are interesting criteria to look at and you can see some of those can be changed and some of those are really hard to change. You're not going to change overnight the size of the Latvian market. There's no way, right? But you can have a different perspective when you build companies. And you can also maybe improve some of the regulations, some of the taxations. You can try to get skills from outside. You can send people outside, bring back skills. There's many ways of improving the ecosystem that can be quite fast. But even then, it might take a few cycles. If you look at Israel ecosystem today, it's fantastic. They've had so many like unicorns and very large exits. 10 years ago, they were building mostly kind of add-on technologies targeting large customers. And they had mid-size exits like 10 million, 20, 30 million. Pretty good, for sure, for an entrepreneur, life-changing, but not the hundreds and billions that they have today. So it took a few cycles as well. About exits, actually a really important topic. Last year, even though we're a very early stage investor, we decided to look into the topic of exits more closely. Typical startup takes 8 to 10 years to exit. That's pretty typical. So when we invest, wait 10 years. Have to be patient. But we decided, okay, let's look into it because some of our startups are maturing and maybe we could help them more, guide them toward how to do a better exit. Because sometimes they might miss opportunities and sometimes they might leave money on the table if they don't do it well. So we organized a series of conferences in different cities. We invited a lot of experts and we didn't just invite other investors and founders. We also invited the customers for those companies, such as corporate development people. They're the clients. They're the people buying companies on behalf of corporations. We invited bankers. We invited lawyers. What's very interesting to observe is that generally in startup circles, everybody's pretty casual. You have the jacket, jeans, or just T-shirt, and pretty casual, at least in US and a number of markets. So it's kind of one orbit of casual people. And then there's another orbit of more formal people, the bankers, the lawyers, the corporate development people. And there's not many bridges between the two. You rarely see those people on stage at startup conferences, even though they're so critical to make those deals. Last one, we actually had John Chambers, former CEO of Cisco, and you see on that slide 180. That's the number of companies he bought when he was at Cisco, 180 companies. So he had a few things to say about acquisitions and how to make it work. So this is what we learned. In a few words, first is to realize that, okay, unicorns are great. Everybody's super focused on unicorns, having really flashy things. Great if you can have one. Much better, possibly, to have many exits because it recycles faster capital, recycles faster talent. IPOs, that's great, of course, very flashy. The story keeps going because the company is public. But in fact, IPOs are quite rare. It's less than 10% of exits, actually less than 5% of exits. Most exits are M&As. And it doesn't mean M&As are not good exits. M&As can be fantastic, actually pay off better than IPOs. But you have to prepare. And how do you prepare? Into just a few words, you have to be visible for potential buyers, and you have to connect with them very early. So now we encourage even our very early stage, prototype stage startups to get to know potential buyers for their companies. Problem is that in the VC world, most venture capitalists are actually focused on those very large exits. So, because for them, that's what's going to make return the fund. Like in the future IPO of Uber, one fund is going to make $10 billion, benchmark capital. It's going to make $10 billion from the exit. Wonderful. They don't care about all the other exits of that fund. Just that one is enough. But when you're an entrepreneur, you have one egg in one basket. So you think a little bit differently. So you have to think first, maybe it's quite okay to be a millionaire before being a billionaire. Actually, very often that's what happens, even for Elon Musk. He exited a few companies before building gradually bigger and bigger ones. So you have to balance risk. It's critical to the health of the ecosystem. Another thing that's actually not really talked about, because it's like a little bit like a fish in water. You talk to people in Silicon Valley or in the US in general, you're like, oh, what happens if you fail? And that doesn't seem to be a bit of a problem. They're like, oh, we're very entrepreneurial, we accept failure. What they're actually saying is that they're not too worried about finding a job if the company fails, because the job market is very fluid. There's a lot of appetite for whatever startup talent, and it's expensive. So they're fine. But that's not the case in other places. So in a way, in terms of safety net, Silicon Valley is like walking a slack line about 10 centimeters from the ground. In most other markets, walking a bit higher. Maybe you break an arm if you fall. In Japan, I remember a discussion with former CEO of Hitachi. I asked him, what happens if an engineer, a really good engineer from Hitachi, leaves, does something else, let's say a startup for a couple of years, and wants to come back? And he scratched his head and he said, at least in my time, we would not forgive him. What do you do then if the company that knows you're good could use you. You would like to come back, you're motivated, you actually learn new things outside, they don't want you. What are the other ones going to say? So that's the challenge. And that's difficult to change. So now let's talk about deep tech and the opportunities in deep tech. So first, to those of you working on deep tech companies, congratulations. You're doing something important. It's not easy. And it's actually really important because it's putting actually software, in many cases, into the real world. And the real world is very inefficient. We need to maintain it. We need to improve it. There's a lot to do. So congratulations to you. To define deep tech, we had recently an event. That's the theme of this year, is deep tech, investing in deep tech. We're organizing, again, a series of events. There's not that many, so I was very happy to get the invitation to here. I was like, oh, finally somebody's talking about deep tech. The definition is not that clear yet, but essentially it's a mix of computer science and something else. Could be physics, could be medical science, could be something else. Generally takes longer time and more capital. It has walls, it has moats to protect itself, so those are things to overcome, but also things that protect you. The problem is that it combines more risk. You have technical risk, that's generally number one, then market risk and execution risk. So that's why investors are a bit reluctant, because they're like, oh, that all compounds, it's problematic. Why do investors typically pass? They say it's too early. It means you haven't proven it's a safe enough thing, because investors, even though they're called venture capitalists, they're really into the management of risk. And they feel it's too early means too much risk. Some of them have restrictions, like they only focus on certain geographies, invest in competitors, market's too small, don't know enough about this market. Reality is that one thing they don't really tell you, that they don't think you can do it. If they invest in a competitor and you look much more amazing and much faster and much more efficient, they might think again. Even same for the too early. What's too early? If you show you have experience building the same type of company before, you're going to get a check very quickly because you're bankable and proven entrepreneur. So what can you do? Recently, I was meeting with a team. They're making flying cars. So it used to be something fancy and futuristic. Now there's like half a dozen companies trying on actually succeeding at building different flying cars. So they're working on things like subsystems like flying tech, the time travel, the Mr. Fusion. Okay, more practically, they're working on propulsion, aerodynamics, structure, noise, battery, regulations, and customers. And the question for this type of technology is how long, how much, and is it the right team? I see I have to accelerate quite a bit, so sorry for that. So the challenge, building the right thing, is how do you build the right thing? Can you build something 10 times better than what's out there? Can you scale it? Do you have the right team? Are you at the right time? And do you have the right resources? So the right thing, these days, there's organizations that help you figure out early on if you work on the right thing, mostly by going out and talking to potential customers. And I think you do some of the business matching in this event, and I think this is a really good opportunity to do that. Probably the best in class is the I-Core program in the US that combined practice around the business model canvas, customer discovery, interviews. They encourage founders to do about 100 interviews in about 7 weeks, and they have weekly updates, and agile methodology. I'll give you a quick example. Autonomo is a company that wanted to build agtech, large-scale mowing, agricultural weeding. They were not quite sure which one to pick. They went out. For 7 weeks, they conducted about 20 interviews, 6 site visits, and then they realized mowing, not much interested. Weeding, yes. They were using lots of temporary workforce, very costly, very problematic. They also realized that those people had already tractors. They didn't care about autonomy. So the Autonomo name was not needed anymore. It was not autonomy and mowing. It was Autonomo is no more, was one of their slides after a few weeks. They implemented the computer vision to check for weeds. They looked at technologies to help eradicate weeds, hesitated between laser and oil spray. Eventually picked oil spray, even though laser is probably cooler. And they built a company called Blue River that got acquired a few years later by John Deere, the tractor company, for about $300 million. Also shows that technology, deep tech, is not in every sector. Interestingly, actually, we also invested recently in the next generation of those type of technologies with more autonomous, actually, vehicles. And I found that in the latest batch of this iCore program, there's another company working on weeding, but this time they're using fire, like they spit fire on the plants. And they do crop counting using computer vision. So the right team is number one risk at an early stage. And as a team, you have to be learning machines. And I'll tell you a bit about the problems we found in the many teams we invested in. Those are some of the problems. I think for scientific teams, the biggest problems are actually those three. Can't execute. Artists means they're not flexible enough to adjust to the market needs and want to do just one thing. On maker addiction. Maker addiction means you keep prototyping, improving it, never shipping. And you have to evolve as a founder from an inventor to an engineer, to an entrepreneur, and to a manager. Sometimes you're the right person to do all of that. Sometimes you might want assemble a team around you to take care of those skills. At Hacks and at SOSV, we do a little profiling after we invest in our first check. Before the second check, we get the teams to evaluate themselves. And there's like 4 quadrants about the rational self, the experimental self, kind of entrepreneurial aspect, the feeling, more emotional, communication part, and the organization one. And you can see some are typically quite weak. Right time, figure out whether the market is ready for your thing. As a startup, you're always a little bit ahead of the curve, but too ahead is terrible. Those guys managed to survive, founded 2011, raised $2 million over time. They launched 7 years later only. And the product didn't impress that much because the market caught up with them. So where do you find the best resources? Over time, I really apologize for that, so I'm going to go for really fast. For some sectors like movies, you go to Hollywood. If you're in comedy, you go to maybe New York or Montreal or some other places. And just like a startup, you iterate on your subsystems. Subsystems as your jokes. You can practice them 6 times per night in different clubs, and then you get instant feedback, which is really important to know if you're going the right way. And that's how you end up with your product. Silicon Valley, unfortunately these days, for early stage startups, is a very expensive place to do all this. So the idea is, where can you find the science? Where can you do your science? Prototype, production, funding, and where can you find your customers? And they're not all in one place, and they're not necessarily in Silicon Valley. So target for the next milestone on what the resources you need to get there. So this is on the product side, but don't forget also the sales side. And that's something a lot of technical startups tend to forget, is also to validate the sales. Speed up prototyping, we do that in Shenzhen for electronics. For biology, we do in San Francisco and London. I'm going to skip some of that. The idea is really to spend basically the shortest time possible to do the most progress possible. So just quick summary of ideas. Use the local leverage you have. If you have a lot of technical talent here, do keep the talent here and do the R&D here. But then think about where you can do the rest, where you can find the resources for prototyping, where you can find the resources for production, your customers, and your funding. Don't all have to be here. So you need to connect to other ecosystems. You need to go out. You need to bring people in. Think of that. So just to close, I'll quote a few people. One is a Polish guy who's now based in Germany and built a number of companies. He's the chairman of Delivery Hero, a company that IPO'd for a few $1 billion. I had the pleasure to interview him a few months ago. And I asked him, okay, is there an advantage to be in Europe? He said, well, Europe has talent, Europe has capital now, and we have one advantage. This advantage is that we can go global because we used to deal with differences in markets and cultures. And that's one of our skills. So that's something to keep in mind and to leverage to be able to access those resources elsewhere. That's all I have, Paldies. And to quote finally Captain Dissolution again, love with your heart and use your head for everything else. Thank you very much.